They told her the ship was dead. They were wrong about that too. Rosalind Achterberg had a rule, and the rule was simple. Check it twice, then check it again. Because the first time you trust yourself completely is the time you kill someone. She had been living by that rule for 11 years, ever since a reactor cascade on a freighter called the Meridian Vow taught her exactly what her instincts were worth when she didn't slow down to question them. 6 people had died learning that lesson alongside her. She had lived to keep learning it over and over in the crawl spaces and access shafts of every ship the Coalition had ever handed to a human crew. She had been 19 on the Vow, junior enough that nobody expected her to catch anything the senior mechanics missed, old enough that she'd told herself she was ready anyway. Her mentor, a broad-shouldered dockyard veteran named Petrus Kell, had spent 4 years teaching her to listen to a reactor housing the way other people listen to a heartbeat, and on the night it mattered most, she had listened, and hesitated, and second-guessed the thing her hands already knew. And by the time she'd stopped arguing with herself, the cascade had already started. 4 seconds. That was all it had taken, 4 seconds of doubt, and Kell and 5 others were gone by morning, and Ro had spent every day since building herself into someone who did not get to have that particular kind of doubt anymore. It was not a story she told often. It lived under her skin permanently enough that she didn't need to say it out loud to feel it. The Ashvalon's Reach was not a good ship. It was an old ship. A patched-together carrier the Coalition had given to its newest and least trusted member species because nobody else wanted it. 3 decks of retrofitted analog wiring bolted onto a quantum net spine that every other species considered the only architecture worth building. Command staff called the human sections the basement without much affection. Ro didn't mind. She liked the basement. Down there, wrenches did what wrenches were supposed to do, and nothing pretended to think for itself. The basement had its own rhythms, ones Ro had come to trust more than she trusted most people. The low hum of the coolant pumps at second shift, the particular clank of deck plate 17C, which had never quite sat flush no matter how many times she'd shimmed it. The way the recycled air tasted faintly of ozone near the relay banks, a taste she'd stopped noticing years ago and only remembered when a new transfer wrinkled their nose at it. She had crewed 6 ships in 9 years of Coalition service, and every one of them had taught her something new about the particular stubbornness of machines designed to fail gracefully and then handed down to people nobody expected to keep them running well past their intended service life. The Reach was the oldest of the 6. The Reach was also in the quiet arithmetic Ro kept in the back of her mind and never said aloud. The one she trusted most, because age meant redundancy, and redundancy meant the kind of manual backups that newer, prouder ships had long since stripped out as unnecessary weight. She was 30 meters below the bridge, elbow deep in a coolant manifold, when Ilven found her. The Ketthari engineer was young, even by Ketthari standards, all long fingers and quick nervous energy, with the faint bioluminescent striping along his jaw that meant he hadn't finished his final growth cycle. He had been assigned to her 8 months ago as a disciplinary measure, some infraction involving an unauthorized modification to a drone bay that Ro had quietly decided not to ask about. And in that time, he had gone from resentful to something uncomfortably close to devoted. He carried her tools before she asked for them now. He remembered which valve stuck on which deck. He asked questions like he was afraid the answers would run out. "You're doing it again," Ilven said, crouching beside her. "Doing what?" "The face. The one you make when the ship tells you something it isn't telling anyone else." Ro didn't look up from the manifold. Her left hand, the one with the nerve damage, was doing the delicate work by feel, while her right hand held the diagnostic tablet steady, because if she let the left hand try to read a screen, it would shake, and she would lose 10 minutes to frustration and pride. 11 years of practice had turned that shake into something almost useful. She had learned to listen to a ship through her fingertips the way sighted people took light for granted, and down here in the tight, dark spaces where display panels were an afterthought that mattered more than any of the officers upstairs understood. "There's a diagnostic ping in the reactor feed," she said. "Low frequency, comes and goes. Command's calling it sensor noise." "Is it sensor noise?" "No." She said it the way she said most things that scared her. Quietly, without inflection, like the words might spook if she said them any louder. "I heard this exact ping 11 years ago, right before the VOW's #2 reactor cascaded. Everybody called that noise too." Ilvin's striping dimmed slightly, a Kethari tell for concern. "You reported it." "I reported it." Ro finally looked up. Her eyes were the pale, tired gray of someone who had spent 2 decades staring into machinery instead of sky. "Lieutenant Corvain told me humans have a talent for imagining catastrophe where there's only inefficiency." His words. Wrote it into the log that way too, in case anyone wanted to remember exactly how funny he thought it was. "That's not fair. Fair's not the word I'd use for it." She wiped her hands on a rag that had been white about a decade ago. "It's not personal, Ilven. It's just what we are to them. Useful hands, not a source of insight. You get used to it." "I don't think you should have to." "I don't think that's up to either of us." She said it gently, because the kid meant well, and because some truths you didn't get to argue your way out of, no matter how young and certain you were. Command didn't listen to analog mechanics. Command listened to the quantum net, and the net said everything was fine. And 11 years of accumulated bureaucratic contempt for the newest member species meant that a human's read of a strange vibration in the deck plates simply did not outweigh a green light on a screen. Ilven had heard the story of the Meridian Vow exactly once, months ago, late in a shift when Ro was too tired to keep her usual careful silence about it, and he had never brought it up again, not because he'd forgotten, but because he understood, in the way only someone who genuinely respected her could, that it wasn't his to bring up. What he had taken from the story instead, quietly, privately, was the shape of the woman it had made. Someone who assumed nothing, verified everything, and treated a shaking hand not as a wound to hide, but as a teacher whose lessons she'd simply had to learn a harder way than anyone should. He tried in his own clumsy apprentice way to learn the same lessons without needing his own disaster to teach them to him. She went back to the manifold. The ping came again. She felt it more than heard it. A stutter in the coolant flow that lasted less than a second, gone before her tablet even registered a fluctuation worth flagging. Old fear, cold and familiar, settled into her chest and stayed there. Later that shift, she took the reading up to Engineering Command anyway, because reporting it was the part of the rule that didn't depend on anyone believing her. The engineering deck up there looked nothing like her basement. Clean lines, ambient light that shifted color with the ship's day-night cycle, consoles that hummed instead of clanked. Lieutenant Commander Senoth Corvain looked up from a transit log he was annotating for a promotion board and gave her the same expression he always gave her, patient in the particular way that made patience feel like an insult. "Achterberg." He said her name like it cost him something. Another anomaly. A recurring one. Same signature I logged 11 years ago on a different ship, 6 hours before a reactor cascade killed 6 people. She kept her voice flat, because she had learned that flat traveled further than urgent ever did, at least with men like Corvain. "I'd like it flagged for a full diagnostic sweep before next transit. The net reads the reactor at 98% nominal efficiency across all 4 cores." He said it the way he said most things to her. Not unkindly exactly, just from a great and comfortable height. "I understand your species places a great deal of faith in instinct, Achterberg. It's rather charming in its way. But the quantum net does not miss 98% of a reactor's operating profile because a human felt something in her fingertips. With respect, sir, The net didn't catch it on the vow either. That's the whole point of the report. Noted. He had already looked back down at his log. I'll have someone review the sensor calibration when we make port. 3 decks up, in a control room full of sleek, quantum-linked consoles that required no cables, no manual backups, nothing but trust in a network that had never failed anyone important enough to notice when it did, Corvain went back to thinking about promotion boards. He did not think about the ping again. He had already decided, months ago, that human mechanics saw ghosts in machinery because ghosts were the only thing that made their jobs feel important. It was not cruelty, exactly. It was simply the comfortable arithmetic of a species that had never had to build anything with its hands in 300 years, looking down at a species that still did, and assuming the difference meant something about worth instead of history. Rowe walked back down to the basement without arguing further, because arguing further had never once changed an outcome in 9 years of trying, and because some part of her, the part that had learned its lessons on the Meridian Vow and never forgotten them, had already started quietly preparing for the possibility that nobody upstairs was going to help her in time. She spent the rest of the shift doing something she never logged anywhere. Walking every analog relay junction on her assigned decks, checking each one by hand, memorizing which breakers fed which systems, the way a person checks the locks on a house when they can't shake the feeling a storm is coming. The Reach moved on through the Kestrel Drift, 2 civilian evacuation transports tucked into her escort formation like chicks under a hen too old and too tired to know it was still capable of violence. Nobody on the bridge saw the Vashtu remnant ships until the moment they wanted to be seen. The attack came out of a dust-thick nebula fold that the Reach's sensors had rated as unlikely concealment terrain, a rating that would later be quietly struck from every training manual the Coalition still used. 4 scavenger vessels, stripped down and cobbled from 3 different collapsed Empire's hulls, dropped their stealth fields in perfect unison and opened fire with weapons designed for exactly one purpose. Not destruction, but paralysis. EMP-adjacent pulse cannons, illegal under half a dozen Coalition treaties the Vashtu remnant had never signed, swept across the Reach's hull in a wave that found every quantum net conduit on the ship and cooked it in the same half-second. For one instant, before anything else happened, every light on the ship burned white-hot bright, every screen flooded with cascading errors too fast to read, and every automated voice on the intercom system tried to say something reassuring in the same half-second that it died mid-syllable. Then the Reach went black, all 400 meters of her. The hum that had been under Rowe's feet, every hour of every day for 9 years, simply gone. Replaced by a silence so total, it felt like the ship had stopped breathing. The bridge went dark first. Every console, every readout, every automated safety system across 400 meters of Coalition warship died at once, and with it died the illusion that any of the officers standing on that bridge had ever actually known how to fly a ship. They had known how to tell a ship what they wanted and trusted to comply. Nobody had taught them what to do when it stopped listening. Corvain stood in the sudden blackness of his own bridge and discovered in the worst possible way that command authority is not a rank. It is a function of knowing what to do next. He knew nothing. Around him, officers who had spent their careers issuing verbal instructions to systems that translated intention into action were reduced to shouting into consoles that no longer had the courtesy to pretend to listen. One of the junior tactical officers, a Voska woman named Idren, who had graduated top of her class from a war college that had not run a single exercise involving total system failure in over a century, stood frozen at her station with both hands pressed flat against a display that would never light again, saying the word reboot over and over in a voice that kept climbing half a register each time. Corvain did not blame her. He would have said the same word himself if he'd thought of it first, and if he'd been able to make his own voice work. 30 meters down in the dark, Ro Achterberg felt the ship die around her and did not panic, because she had spent 11 years training herself for exactly this moment, without ever quite admitting that was what she was doing. Her tablet screen died with everything else, useless glass in her hand, and for the first time all shift she was glad of it, because a dead screen meant one less thing, asking her ruined hand to do something it couldn't. Ilven. Her voice, when it mattered, did not get louder. It got quieter. Emergency lighting, manual relay, section by section. You know the sequence. The net's completely down, Ro. I can't even get a status. You don't need the net. You need your hands and the wiring diagram in your skull, which you have, because I put it there. She was already moving, one palm against the bulkhead, reading the ship through vibration, the way she'd learned to after the shake in her hand made screens a liability instead of a tool. Manual override relay bank 2. Follow me. The Reach's human-crewed sections had never been rewired to match the rest of the ship, because nobody in 9 years of Coalition membership had considered it worth the expense of upgrading the primitive decks assigned to the primitive species. Every human mechanic on board had spent 9 years quietly, resentfully grateful for a hand-me-down analog backbone that every other species treated as an embarrassment. That backbone was the only thing on the entire ship still capable of carrying a command. Ro found the first relay bank by feel in absolute darkness, her ruined left hand finding contacts her eyes couldn't have located half as fast even with light, and through the manual breaker that fed emergency life support to the crew decks. Somewhere above her, in air that had gone stale and cold in the 90 seconds since the pulse hit, people who had never once thought about how oxygen got to a room started breathing easier, without knowing why. Life support section 3, online, she said into a comm line that shouldn't have worked and did, because it was wired the old way, hardline copper instead of quantum relay. Ilven, bank 4 now. On it. His voice cracked, but his hands didn't because she had trained them not to. That was the thing about teaching someone the analog way. You were teaching them to trust their own body instead of a network. And a scared body that has been taught to trust itself keeps working even when everything else has stopped. They moved through the dark together, section by section, a rhythm Ro had drilled into both of them without ever calling it a drill. Check the breaker housing for heat before you touch it. Count the contacts twice before you close the circuit. Never trust a relay just because it looks the way it looked the last time you checked it. Bank 3, Bank 4, Bank 6, which Ilven found jammed with debris from the blast and cleared with his bare hands, ignoring the cut it opened across his palm because Ro had also taught him, without meaning to, that some pain simply had to wait its turn. Word of what they were doing spread the way true things spread in a crisis. Not through any announcement, because the announcement systems were dead, but hand to hand, deck to deck, human mechanic to human mechanic, as each one remembered the same drills and started throwing the same breakers in their own assigned sections without needing to be told. Within 6 minutes, more than half the Reach's human-crewed decks had partial power restored through analog relay alone, a fact that would not be fully appreciated by anyone above Deck 15 until long after the fighting was over. Command authority on the Reach did not collapse because anyone gave up. It collapsed because it had never been real authority to begin with, only the appearance of control, borrowed from a network now cooling into slag in the walls. The real chain of command, the one nobody upstairs had ever bothered to notice existed, ran through a woman with a shaking hand crawling through crawl spaces 30 meters below the bridge, restoring her ship's ability to breathe one relay at a time. The boarding pods launched 40 minutes after the first pulse strike, sleek dark shapes crossing the gap between the scavenger vessels and the Reach's hull with the unhurried confidence of predators who had never once been made to hurry. The Vashtu remnant did not consider this piracy. They considered it salvage rights, exercised against a ship their sensors confirmed was fully inert. No active weapons, no responsive shielding, no functioning quantum net signature anywhere aboard. By every metric their culture recognized, the Ashvalan's reach was a corpse waiting to be stripped, and its crew were cargo waiting to be claimed, because among the Vashtu remnant, boarding a dead ship and taking its people as salvage was not cruelty. It was mercy, compared to leaving them to suffocate in the wreck of a vessel that could no longer sustain them. They had no way of knowing the wreck had a heartbeat that ran on copper wire instead of quantum fields. The Vashtu remnant commander leading the boarding action, a scarred veteran of a dozen collapsed Empire salvage runs named Threk Osvain, had done this exact maneuver on 11 previous coalition vessels without incident. His people had a ritual for it, almost gentle in its own brutal logic. Approach only after all defensive systems confirmed dead. Breach only the minimum number of hull points necessary. Take crew as salvage rather than casualties wherever compliance made it possible. It was not kindness, not in any sense a coalition ethicist would recognize, but within Vashtu doctrine it was the closest thing to mercy their culture had ever bothered to develop, an efficient harvesting of ships too broken to be worth destroying outright. Osvain had briefed his boarding teams with the same confidence he always used. No active defenses, no organized resistance, minimal risk. He believed every word of it because his senses told him it was true. And his senses had never once been wrong about a target this thoroughly gutted. Ro met the first wave of boarders in a maintenance corridor she had chosen with more care than anyone gave her credit for. She had spent the 40 minutes since the attack doing more than restoring life support. She had been thinking, the same slow, methodical, over-check-it-twice thinking that had kept her alive and blameless for 11 years, about everything in her domain that had never been designed as a weapon but could, with the right hands and the right desperation, become one. She gathered the other human mechanics on the lower decks in the flickering half-light of the restored emergency systems and laid it out for them the way she'd lay out a repair plan. Calm, specific, no wasted words. They think this ship is a corpse. That's the only advantage we've got, so we use it. Every tool in your kit was built to fix something. Today it's going to break something instead. I want choke points, not open ground. I want them blind before they're hurt, and hurt before they know we're here. Nobody argued, nobody had time to, and more than that, nobody wanted to. Not after 9 years of being told their hands were only good for maintenance, not command. This was, in its own grim way, the first time in 9 years anyone had asked a human crew what they thought they could do, instead of telling them what they were allowed to. The magnetic hull patch kit was the first thing she reached for. Designed to seal microfractures in the outer hull by generating a localized magnetic clamp field strong enough to hold a patch plate against vacuum pressure, it was never meant to be pointed at anything but a wall. Ro pointed it at the boarding corridor's deck plating instead, cranked the field strength past every safety limit stenciled on its casing, and turned the entire floor of a 6-meter stretch of corridor into a magnetic trap. The instant the Vashtu remnant's armored boarding party, heavy exosuits built from scavenged plating, magnetically receptive by design, because their own tech had never bothered to shield against it, set foot on it. The corridor lights, what few of them Ro had managed to coax back to life, flickered a sickly amber over scorched bulkheads as the boarding party advanced in a loose diamond formation, confident in a way only a force expecting zero resistance could afford to be. Ro watched them come from the shadow of a maintenance alcove, her breathing slow and even, despite the hammering under her ribs, waiting for the exact moment the lead boarder's boot crossed the threshold she'd primed. The lead boarder went down hard, suit locked flat against the deck, weapon arm pinned uselessly at his side. The three behind him staggered, servo motors screaming against a pull they had no framework for, because nothing in Vashtu doctrine accounted for a supposedly dead ship generating an active field of any kind. Kavash tho, Nara sen. The Vashtu squad leader's voice crackled over an open channel Ro's borrowed comm equipment happened to catch, sharp with a panic that needed no translation. Something is active. This ship is not dead. His second, further back and less pinned, answered in the same clipped dialect, and even without full translation, Ro understood the shape of it. Recalculate. Recalculate. This reading was wrong. She didn't wait for them to recalculate. The plasma welding torch came next, a tool she had used 10,000 times to fuse hull plating, never once designed as a weapon, but a torch is a torch, and a jet of superheated plasma aimed through the narrow gap of an exosuit's joint seal does not care what its manufacturer intended. She burned through the servo cabling of the second boarder's knee joint from a maintenance alcove 8 meters back, dropping him in a shower of sparks and a scream that his suit's vocal dampener didn't quite catch in time. The third weapon was quieter, and in its way crueler than either of the others. Not because it hurt more, but because it was the one that made the Vash-2 commander finally understand what he was actually fighting. Ro rerouted a length of coolant piping that ran the length of the corridor, meant to carry waste heat away from the reactor decks, and instead vented it directly into the boarding corridor at full pressure and temperature, just as the surviving boarders regrouped. Not enough to kill through the suits. Enough to fog every external sensor lens on every exosuit in that corridor with condensation and heat shimmer, blinding a force that depended entirely on sensor feeds to coordinate, because nothing in their doctrine imagined an enemy would simply cook the air around them with a repurposed radiator line. Nara vendokal suven torash. The commander's voice again, and this time there was something underneath the panic that Ro recognized, because she had heard its human equivalent 100 times in her own head. The sound of someone realizing the categories they'd sorted the universe into were wrong. Later, translated properly by the Coalition's linguists for the official report, that line would read, roughly, "They are not derelict. They are not helpless. Reclassify. Reclassify now." Commander Osvain had spent 30 years cataloging exactly how helpless a target could be made to look before it stopped fighting back. And every instinct that 30 years had built into him was screaming that the numbers on this ship had never once added up the way his sensors insisted they should. Dead ships did not fog their own corridors. Dead ships did not turn their own hull repair equipment into restraints. Somewhere underneath the fear his own crew could hear leaking into his voice, a colder and more useful thought was forming, one that would follow him long after the Kestrel drift. Whatever the Coalition had been telling the galaxy about its newest, weakest member species, somebody had been lying. And it very much had not been the humans. It was the exact moment, unremarked and unrecorded by anyone who would ever think to put it in a history book, that at least one member of the Ashvalon Coalition looked at a human being and understood for the first time that useful but primitive and dangerous when cornered were not mutually exclusive categories. Humans had not been miscounted as harmless because they were harmless. They had been miscounted because nobody had ever bothered to ask what a species does with its hands when the machines it's been handed down finally fail. The retreat wasn't clean. Retreats never are. But the Vash-2 remnant second wave came through more cautiously, weapons up, sensors compensating for a threat environment their doctrine hadn't prepared them for, and cautious boarders are slow boarders, and slow boarders gave the rest of the Reach's human crew, spreading Ro's methods deck by deck, the way fire spreads through dry grass. Time to turn 6 more corridors into traps built from wrenches and torches and repurposed plumbing. It cost Ro more than she expected it to. She was alone in Junction 7, the compartment that fed emergency power to the aft life support cluster, when the compartment beside it, the one where Ilvin had been rerouting a coolant bypass to keep the fires from reaching the civilian transport docking clamps, took a direct hit from a Vash-2 breaching charge. The blast didn't kill him. It did worse, in the short term. It buckled the bulkhead between his compartment and the flooding ballast tank behind it, and Ilvin found himself trapped in rising water with a jammed hatch and a comm line that kept cutting in and out. Ro, The hatch is stuck, I can't. The water's at my chest. I can't get the manual release to... I'm coming. She was already moving, dragging a toolkit that suddenly felt twice as heavy as it had an hour ago, because her left hand had stopped shaking from stress and started shaking from something closer to shock. She'd taken shrapnel across the back of that hand in the blast that trapped him. 3 fingers bent wrong, the whole thing screaming in a language her body understood even when her mind refused to listen. Junction 7's critical reroute needed 2 working hands, and about 4 minutes she didn't have. She had 1 working hand, a hand that no longer worked at all, and maybe 90 seconds before the compartment flooding toward Ilven reached the ceiling. The corridor around her was filling with a haze that stung her eyes and turned every breath into something she had to work for. A fire 2 decks up, feeding on cable insulation and old sealant faster than the half-restored scrubbers could clear it. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, louder than the fire, louder than Ilven's voice cracking through the comm, a hard, fast drumbeat that told her exactly how frightened her body was, even as she refused to let that fear reach her hands. Heart rate 164, and climbing, according to the medical patch on her wrist that she had no time to look at and every reason to ignore. Hull pressure in Junction 7's adjoining compartment, reading catastrophic and rising, a number that meant Ilven had less air left than either of them wanted to say out loud. She worked anyway. She had spent 11 years training her ruined hand to read a ship by feel precisely because she had once frozen, once when speed and confidence mattered more than caution, and 6 people had died for that freeze. This was not that moment. This was the opposite of that moment, and some small, clear part of her recognized it, even through the pain and the smoke starting to curl in from a fire 2 decks up, that the ship's dying atmospheric scrubbers weren't clearing fast enough. Oxygen levels in her own compartment had dropped to 61% and were still falling. She stripped the burned insulation off the reroute cable with her teeth because her right hand needed to hold the conduit steady, and her left hand couldn't grip anything anymore, and she spliced the connection blind, by feel, the way she had trained herself to do for exactly this reason, without ever admitting to herself that she'd been training for this exact night for 11 years. The bypass took. Emergency drainage kicked in on the flooding compartment 30 seconds before it would have gone from dangerous to fatal. It wasn't enough on its own. The jammed hatch was still jammed, and Ro's hands, both of them now, were done. The left from the shrapnel, the right from 4 minutes of raw, ungloved work against sparking conduit. She was still trying to find a way through it, coughing smoke, vision starting to tunnel at the edges, when Ilven's voice came back over the comm, steadier than it had any right to be. "Ro, stop. I've got it." "Ilven." The clamp release. "You taught me the clamp release on the airlock cycling override 3 months ago, remember? You said, if the hatch won't listen, make it listen a different way. I'm not stuck. I'm using the magnetic hull kit from the emergency locker. Same trick you pulled on the boarders. Give me 30 seconds. She heard it happen more than she saw it. The shriek of a hatch built to resist force, yielding instead to a magnetic pulse it was never designed to withstand. Ilven's own borrowed trick, her trick, turned back against the very door that had trapped him. He came through soaked and coughing, dragging himself the last meter on knees that clearly didn't want to hold him, and Ro caught him with her one good arm before he went fully down, both of them sliding against the bulkhead, into a heap that neither of them had the strength left to be embarrassed about. For one long, unsteady moment, in a smoke-filled corridor 30 meters below a bridge full of officers who still didn't fully understand what had saved them, Ro Achterberg let herself remember the Meridian Vow. She remembered the reactor cascade she hadn't caught in time. She remembered freezing for 4 seconds too long, while her mentor shouted numbers she couldn't process fast enough. 4 seconds that had cost 6 lives and every ounce of confidence she'd ever had in her own instincts. She had spent 11 years building herself into someone who would never freeze again, and she had just found out, in the worst classroom the universe could have built for the final exam, that it had worked. She hadn't frozen. She had acted, hurt and half-blind and running on 11 years of quiet, grinding discipline, and the kid she'd trained had learned enough from her to save both their lives when her own hands finally gave out. "You did good," she told him, and her voice, when it mattered most, didn't shake at all. The Vashtu remnant broke off the assault 11 minutes later, when a coalition patrol wing responding to the Reach's last automated distress ping, sent in the half-second before the quantum net died, more luck than plan, arrived to find 4 scavenger vessels trying to disengage from a derelict that had somehow put functional weapons fire into 2 of their hulls, using systems their sensors insisted didn't exist. Commander Osvane gave the withdrawal order himself, over a channel his own crew would later say they had never heard him use that particular tone on before. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man recalculating an entire career's worth of assumptions in real time. 2 Vashtu ships were captured intact, their crews taken into coalition custody without further resistance. The other 2 fled the Kestrel Drift and did not come back. The patrol wing's medical shuttles found Ro and Ilven still propped against the same bulkhead in Junction 7 20 minutes later. Both of them conscious. Both of them refusing to be moved until the last of the flooding compartments had been confirmed clear. They pulled 41 survivors out of the wreckage of the Reach's lower decks that day, 26 of them human. All of them alive, because a woman with a shaking left hand had refused, 11 years ago and every day since, to let herself trust a single instinct without checking it twice. The Reach herself would need 6 weeks in dry dock, her quantum net spine gutted and rebuilt from the keel outward, every hardline analog relay on her human-crewed decks left conspicuously, deliberately untouched. A junior engineering officer, reviewing the retrofit specifications for the repair contract, would later ask her supervisor why nobody was replacing the old wiring along with everything else. The supervisor, who had read the full incident report by then, simply told her to leave it exactly as it was and did not offer a further explanation. Because some lessons once learned properly did not need to be argued for twice. The summons came 4 days later, and it was not the kind of summons anyone expects after saving a ship. Ro stood in a coalition inquiry chamber aboard the fleet's flagship, her injured hand in a medical brace that would take another 2 weeks to come off, facing 3 officers who were not there to thank her. Ilven had asked to attend as a witness on her behalf. She had told him no, gently, because she did not want his career tangled up in whatever the coalition decided to make of hers. The chamber was cold in the particular way rooms are cold when the people running them have decided in advance how the conversation is going to end and are simply waiting for the formalities to catch up. They were there because the Reach's after-action report had flagged something the coalition found more troubling than the attack itself. An entire analog manual override network, active and load-bearing across multiple decks, that no post-incident audit had ever documented, running systems that should have been fully quantum net-dependent decades ago. Ms. Achterberg. The Voska administrator did not use her rank, which she noticed and did not comment on. Your file indicates 9 years of unremarkable technical service. Your actions 4 days ago are, by contrast, remarkably difficult to classify. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, a phrase built for a report rather than for the woman standing in front of him. And Ro understood immediately that this hearing had far less to do with her than with a coalition trying to decide, in real time and against its own long-held instincts, what kind of species it had actually let through its front door 9 years ago. These retrofits, the presiding officer said, a Vosika administrator whose species had abandoned manual backups 4 centuries before humans had learned to smelt iron, were never authorized for combat critical function. You understand this represents a significant irregularity. I understand it represents 41 people who are alive to have this conversation with you at all. Ro said. I'm having a hard time seeing those as the same problem. They are, from a regulatory standpoint, inseparable. An unauthorized system, however effective, sets a precedent your superiors will need to account for. Then account for it, Rowe said. I'm not asking you to thank me. I'm telling you what happened because that's what the report is for. It represents a ship that still had crew alive to file a report, Rowe said. Quiet. Economical. The way she talked when she had already stopped being afraid of the answer. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute is why a system your species was never meant to rely upon for anything beyond routine maintenance was capable of independently sustaining life support, weapons improvisation, and structural repair across an entire vessel with its primary systems fully disabled. Rowe looked at the three officers, beings from species that had built galaxy-spanning networks of instantaneous information and flawless automation. Species that had never once had to teach their hands what their eyes and screens could no longer tell them. And she said the only true thing she had left to say. You built ships that forgot how to survive without being told what to do. We never got the chance to forget. That's not an irregularity, Administrator. That's the only reason any of your people are still breathing to ask me about it. Nobody in the chamber answered her for a long moment. It was not the kind of silence that came from disagreement. It was the kind that came from an entire species quietly rewriting, for the first time in 9 years, exactly what column it had been filing humanity under. She was cleared of any wrongdoing 3 weeks later, in a report that used the word commendable exactly once, and the word irregular 14 times, which struck Rowe as about the right ratio for how the coalition was ever going to see her people, at least for a while yet. Ilven kept his post as her apprentice, and within a month had put in a formal request, approved, to everyone's mild surprise, including his own, to cross-train under Rowe's analog curriculum alongside his standard Ketthari engineering certification. He told her once, half-joking, that he wanted to be able to save someone the way she'd saved him, and Rowe had told him, not joking at all, that he already had. The Reach went into dry dock for repairs that, for the first time in 9 years, included a formal request from Coalition Engineering Command to study, not replace, its human-crewed analog systems. 3 other Coalition carriers received quiet, unpublicized retrofit orders within the month, though none of the accompanying paperwork ever used the word human if it could help it. Old habits, Rowe figured, didn't die as fast as old wiring did. That was fine. She had never needed the credit. She had only ever needed the ship to still be there in the morning, and the people on it to still be breathing, and for 11 years those 2 things had been enough to get her out of bed, and into the crawl spaces one more time. Rowe Achterberg went back to the crawl spaces, back to the coolant manifolds and the wiring diagrams and the quiet, careful work of checking everything twice, because that had never stopped being who she was. But somewhere in the 11 years between a freighter called the Meridian Vow and a carrier called the Ashvalon's Reach, the fear underneath that discipline had finally quietly changed its shape. She no longer checked things twice because she was afraid of what would happen if she trusted herself. She checked them twice because now, finally, she knew exactly what she was capable of when it mattered. And for the first time in 11 years, that knowledge didn't scare her at all. There was a particular kind of quiet that came with that knowledge, one she hadn't expected and didn't quite have a name for. It wasn't peace, not entirely. The memory of the Meridian Vow would never fully let go of her, and she had stopped expecting it to. But it was something close to it. A settling in her chest where the old fear used to sit, and she found she could work through a full shift now without once feeling the ghost of Kel's voice shouting numbers she couldn't process fast enough. The numbers came easier these days. So did the silence afterward. Some of us never got the luxury of forgetting how to survive without being told what to do, she said once, to no one in particular, standing in a repaired corridor that still smelled faintly of scorched coolant. Turns out that was never the weakness you thought it was.